The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Dan Wakefield, author of Expect a Miracle. I'm Eileen Cavanaugh from the Hennepin County Library Program Office. Dan Wakefield is a journalist, novelist, and screenwriter who also leads spiritual autobiography workshops all over the country. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you.
Glad
Good
to
be
have
here.
you here. Yeah. Miracle, the word miracle, has many definitions, and for the purpose of your book, Expect a Miracle, what's your definition?
Well, I like best the third definition in the Random House Dictionary, which is a wonder, a marvel. And that really broadens it out to include what I think of as everyday miracles, as well as the more classic kind of healing miracles, which I've also found.
You know, I was always also thinking of miracle, part of the root of that, mira, to look, which kind of feeds into, I think, a large point in your book, that we fail to look at things in our everyday life. We fail to acknowledge and appreciate miracles.
Yes, and one of my favorite quotes about it is from Willa Cather, and in her novel Death Comes for the Archbishop, she says, "Miracles seem to me to rest not so much on faces and voices coming to us from afar, but on our perceptions being made finer, so that our eyes can see and our ears can hear what is there about us always." And that really says it, because, and it's not only looking, it's listening and touching and smelling, it's using the senses, which in today's world we usually numb and are distracted from. It's like the whole society is a kind of elaborate distraction. And when you really can stop and quiet down and take time to look and listen, and it's not just looking at nature, though that's an important part of it, but one of the most powerful things I came across in my research was a woman rabbi in San Francisco named Nancy Flam, who started something called the Jewish Healing Center. And her services are, the heart of them is the people who gather there telling their concerns. They may have AIDS or cancer, they may just be depressed. And she listens, but she listens with such power that I felt like it almost like see a line connecting her to the person. And she later told me that what she does, she thinks of as the ministry of presence, and that her idea is not to give anyone advice or whatever, but just to be fully present to another human being, and which we so seldom do. And when it happens, it's very powerful.
Well, I think later on in your book you say listening is a gift from God. And I think it is true that it's both a skill and a miracle maybe in itself.
Right, exactly. Well, I think all these things of the senses are part of the miracles that we neglect, part of a sense of the miraculous that's present for everybody, that we all have access to, but that we just put aside or don't even consider.
And you know, maybe the paradox is that we don't think of using our senses in terms of looking at spiritual or miraculous things, because we think they are nonsense items. They are spiritual as opposed to...
Yeah, and it seems to me that whatever we mean by spiritual comes through the senses. And there are ways of, I love, there's the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who's been doing a lot of work in this country recently, and he said the miracle is not to walk on water. The miracle is to walk on the green earth in the present moment. And he talked about how healing that is, and he says it's not a matter of faith, it's a matter of practice. And by that he means this practice of using the senses. I've several times gone to something called a silent dinner, where there's music and but people don't talk, and it's in a very lovely room. And the first time I did it, and I'm sitting there eating, and I think, oh my goodness, this is what a carrot tastes like. You know, like we forget what things taste like, and the silence enables you to like recover that.
And it seems to me in monasteries of old, and maybe today as far as I know, that that's a common practice, to be read to, or to hear music or something of that sort, or complete silence at a meal. So that in our world we're torn, so we're trying to deal with many things at once instead of concentrating on enjoying just one thing.
Yeah, and you know, also when we eat, we're often just talking to other people, or reading the paper, or listening to watching television, listening to the radio, and all of that, you know, which sort of takes us away. The ultimate 90s meal I saw the other night were a man and woman in a very nice restaurant, and they were eating dinner, and each was on a cellular phone. So that's the total wipeout of any sense experience. So.
Makes you wonder what they'll show in that regard 50 years from now. But, do you think that many of us fail to believe in miracles because we aren't able to appreciate the everyday miracles?
Well, I tell you, I've been learning that a lot of people are frightened of the concept of miracles, and they're made very angry by it, and they're just intent on disproving it. And this came up recently with me. In the book, I think the most classical miracle story I have is from a woman I met in Ireland named Marion Carroll. And she was, I met her through two priests there who I have known, and who introduced me to her, and had known her before and after this healing. And she had MS for 17 years. She was in a state where she was paralyzed, blind in one eye, lost control of her bodily functions, had a catheter in her body, and they thought she was going to die, and she was taken to this shrine in Ireland called Knock, K-N-O-C-K, and she was taken under the statue of Our Lady of Knock, where there'd been a vision of the Virgin Mary. And she told me, and she said, you know, I'm just a factory girl. I can't explain what happened, but I can tell you what happened. And she said as she was taken away, she said she didn't even pray for a cure because she thought she was going to die, but she prayed for her children. She was worried of what would happen to them. And she said as she was taken away, she heard a kind of whispery voice that said, put your legs over the side of the stretcher and stand. And she said to herself, oh, don't get getting ideas like that, Marion, and maybe you're hallucinating. And then she heard the voice again. And so she asked the nurse to stop, and she put her legs over the side and stood up. And she said she wasn't even stiff, and she hadn't stood walked for 3 years. Anyway, she came home. The doctor came and said, well, you might as well throw away the wheelchair because you don't need it. And 2 weeks later, they took out the catheter, and she's perfectly fine, and her eyesight returned fully. Other sort of paralysis things were gone, and she's been fine for, I don't know, whatever it is, 10 or 15 years. And a reporter was asking me about this recently, and had been to Ireland to interview Marion, and had interviewed her doctor and checked the records. And this reporter said, well, Mr. Wakefield, this might not be true at all. I've talked to doctors who say that she might have had the symptoms of multiple sclerosis, but maybe she didn't really have multiple sclerosis, as if the thing was some kind of a fraud. I said, well, wait a minute. No matter what you call it or how you diagnose it, isn't it true that you saw the records and the doctor testified to you that she was paralyzed and blind in one eye and lost control of bodily functions? Said yes. Said, and then she was taken under the statue, and then she got up and she didn't have those symptoms, if you want to call them that. I said, yeah, that's right. I said, well, I think most people would consider that a healing. And I said, in fact, it fits the classic definition of a miracle, which is an extraordinary event in the physical world that cannot be explained by the laws of science. Well, I said, I don't know any science or medical textbook says that if somebody's paralyzed and lost all these powers. You can put them under a statue and they're going to be fixed, you know. And yet the person was just, and then this reporter said, well, maybe it was psychosomatic. Maybe she brought on her own illness and then healed herself. Well, I mean, it's like this person is just going to go to any lengths to deny that something happened that they couldn't understand.
There is this fascination, it seems, to deny it, and without looking at the fact that even perhaps given the fact that she may not have had multiple sclerosis, still it was a healing of a sort, no matter how
but
you want
she certainly
to
had some conditions that were very...
There was a before and after.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, if you can't walk and then you can walk, that's pretty significant. Anyway, yeah, it's like there's a real fear and anger of, I guess, of what we can't define, what we can't look up in a book. And again, these kind of healings are not only in religious settings or traditions. There's a book that was put together by something called the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which was founded by the astronaut Edgar Mitchell. And they put together a book which is simply a compilation of accounts from medical journals all over the world of spontaneous remission of various diseases. And there's hundreds of these. The great majority of them are not connected with any religious event, but they're not able to be explained by what we now know about medical science. And so these things do happen, and yet some people get very upset that they happen, almost like they wish they didn't happen. It's very strange, but you know, St. Augustine said there's nothing that goes against the natural law, but it's just that we don't know all the natural law. And of course, science keeps changing. So like when I got out of Columbia College in 1955, I lived in a Newtonian mechanical universe, and now I live in a quantum physics universe in which instead of solid, it's a kind of fluid understanding of the world. So things change. Yeah.
Well, and many people indeed say about scriptural miracles that, hey, they really weren't miracles. They only thought they were at the time because they didn't know what we know today. So I'm wondering if 50 years from today, people will say, oh, well, these weren't miracles because we know so much more. But it's sort of missing the point.
Yeah, it is. Well, see, even the scriptural miracles, there's a great debate going on now about those, and that before I wrote this book, I didn't realize that there was something called the Jesus Seminar, where a lot of theologians are there to try to decide historically what happened, what really didn't happen. And from what I could gather, many of them seem out to disprove the miracles of Jesus. The irony of that to me is some of the things he did are now commonly accepted in alternative medicine. And you know, now the National Institute of Health has a council on alternative medicine. They gave their first grant to a study of the effect of prayer on recovery from drug addiction. And Dr. Larry Dawsey has documented prayer and healing. So these are no longer some fringe things, and techniques of meditation being used in mainstream hospitals. So to now go back and say, oh, Jesus couldn't have done those healings really seems to me bizarre.
In fact, I think Dawsey talks in his book about a survey of a blind study in which they had a group of people with chronic illnesses who were prayed for, and another control group who were not prayed for. The people who were prayed for did not know they were being prayed for, and they saw significant improvement in a faster recovery and more complete recovery in those who had been prayed for, which sort of brings science into that whole disbelief on the topic of
exactly. And you know, it's the physicists who, I think more than any other group, have in the last 10 years brought us to a sense that there is more to the universe than accident. And books like The Tao of Physics by Capra who show that the nature conforms to incredibly complex patterns and so on. So anyway, all this, but it fascinates me that people want to fight that. But there's always been a trend. There's always been an outlook like I didn't realize, but Emile Zola once said, "If I saw a miracle in front of my eyes, I wouldn't believe it." And he wanted to try to
the age of reason.
Yeah, right. And you know, it's one of the interesting things. Rabbi Kushner, who I spoke to, and I have a story of his in the book, and he said to me, and I said, you know, why do you think now this sudden interest in all these things and in miracles? And he said, well, I think people have become disillusioned with the rational. And I think he meant like that kind of outlook, of that kind of interpretation of reason, where, you know, it has to be this or that.
And wasn't that part with the physicists too, who suddenly
right.
said we can't explain everything
right.
by our present framework, and we have to broaden that
right.
a little bit.
Yeah. And it's I guess when people are made to look outside their framework or the paradigm with which they operate in, they get very upset. And you know, and one of an old friend of mine, Marcia Seligson, who's a very respected journalist, had an experience she recounts in the book of somebody spilled boiling water on her legs, and she had third-degree burns, and she was told by the leading burn doctor in Los Angeles that she would have to have skin grafts. And in the meantime, a friend said, would you want to come to a group that meets once a month of psychologists and doctors, and we're sort of experimenting with alternative healing and nothing to lose, so let us see what we can do. And she went and said that she lay down on a table for about an hour, and they did some kind of movements with their hands above her, and she didn't think much of it. And then the next day she woke up and the burn scars were gone. And she said when she went to see the doctor, he got very mad at her. He got angry that this had happened because it didn't conform to his understanding of healing. So that's the kind of thing that happens.
Another very current example that struck me as we speak in June of 1995 was Scott O'Grady, the pilot who was down, whose plane was down in Bosnia. When he did his first press conference after being rescued, he first of all credited God and his love for God and God's love for him with being responsible for the rescue. And I noticed that when the media reported this, most of the media did not report this. He later then went on to thank the Marines and other people, and they focused on that, and most of them left out most of his crediting his spiritual beliefs, which he later elaborated on even more. I thought it was very interesting that there is a sense of almost embarrassment if we want to credit the miraculous or
and
credit
it's particularly in the media. And I've had the feeling in going around and talking about this book that there's a real media gap in this area with the thinking and consciousness of the public, because a lot of these things that are just commonplace now to the public, to lay people, you talk to the media about it, and their response is like from 25 years ago. You know, I remember one producer on a TV show wanted to put a particular story in my book on the air about a man who was a long-distance runner and had an operation. They said he'd never run again, and he met a yoga teacher who did something to his legs, some physical kind of work, and he was able to run again. And then he married the yoga teacher, and it was a nice story, and this producer wanted to put it on. And his boss said, why, we can't put on something like that. That's holistic medicine. I don't know, you know, to most people, especially after Bill Moyer's Healing in the Mind and the work that you'd think that this is something understood, but not to these people, you know, and they're so anxious not to be conned. I mean, you almost get the point that the whole point of journalism is not to be conned. And I've thought a lot of there's a wonderful moment in the movie Malcolm X where Malcolm is out of prison and he's been converted to Islam, and he's preaching on street corners and as a minister of Islam. And one of his old criminal buddies from his former life, who's played by Spike Lee, comes up and listens to him, and then they go out for coffee, and the criminal buddy says, "Man, you were great. You know, that's fabulous. What you're doing out there, oh, it's just great." He says, "Now, tell me, what's the con?" And Malcolm says, there isn't any con. That's what he says, "Oh, come on, you can tell me." You know, and that's the way the media is a lot of times. You know, that there's got to be some ulterior motive, some fakery or something behind it.
Also, it seems as if that's saying that in order to be exciting and dramatic and impactful, it must be a con.
That's right. Yeah.
The real life, the real thing can't be that.
That's right. And I think, you know, I tried to emphasize the fact that, you know, not everybody can get the kind of classic healing, the dramatic, miraculous, physical healing. But what I include as miraculous are those people who have the worst kind of disability or illness, and who take that and make that an occasion for living an even fuller life. And in a way, the most inspiring story I came across was this Vietnam veteran named Lloyd Cantor, who lost both arms, both legs, and one eye in Vietnam. Came back. His mother told him, "Well, you should break off your engagement because obviously your fiancé can't marry you and you can't marry anybody," and both families were against it. But Lloyd said to me, "You know, I was lucky because Loretta loved me and she wanted to marry me." And we listened to all the advice, and then we decided we're going to go ahead and have our lives. And he said, we went to Paris on our honeymoon, and I had to be dragged here and there and slung over people's shoulders, but it was worth it. And they have a wonderful life, a rich life. And he says, you know, he said, we're not formally religious, my wife and I, but we feel that we're not alone, and that and that this is our destiny, and that it's not by accident. And I'm just, you know, really inspired by people like that who take something like that and say, okay, we're going to do it anyway. We're going to live a great life and fulfilling life.
Part of my inspiration when I read that story was to think, oh gosh, look at us with, you know, fairly normal. We don't have all of those losses, and yet we don't probably do as much with our lives as.
Exactly,
Yes.
and we probably do more moaning and whining about the little things that do
don't go
happen.
wrong.
Yeah.
One of the important points that you made that I liked very much was that spirituality takes place in the human community, and it takes place best in a human community where there are people of different culture and experience. It reminds me of something an instructor said to me many years ago. She said, once a year you ought to go out and attend a lecture by someone with whom you violently disagree, or read a book that you would not normally read. And I think she meant not that we should change our mind radically, but that hearing somebody that's at the opposite end of your scale tends to open your own mind and tends to question your own preconceptions.
Yeah, well, that point is really important to me because, well, the whole life I'm leading now really began in 1980, and when I was at a real crisis and terrible shape physically and drinking too much, and I worked my way out of that, and in that process went back to church and began the kind of things I've been writing in workshops and spiritual autobiography and so on. But when I first went back to church, and I was really hungry for spiritual experience, and I was reading everything I could get my hands on, and the great saints and the meditation people and so on. And my image of the great spiritual person was like, if I had to picture, it would be like the lone monk on the mountaintop. And after being in church, after being part of a community of spirit, after about 4 or 5 years, I began to think, no, it's not that at all. It's with other people that the spirit comes through. It's in community, and I believe that deeply. Every day I live, I see more and more proof of that, significance of that. And I quoted the wonderful novelist Louise Erdrich, who talked about moving out of our own little enclosed world and taking the risk of meeting other people And it is a risk, and taking the risk of moving out of just the little area that we're comfortable in. And all of that is part of this, I think, movement of the Spirit. I think one of the reasons that spirituality today has become part of the public consciousness is due to the 12-step programs, and that where people recognize a higher power. Even if that's all, they may not call it God, or it may not be tied to any particular religious belief, but just the recognition of a higher power in the universe, and that whole community that those programs have brought, as well as the churches and synagogues and ashrams and religious groups of every kind.
And in a sense, all of those higher beings, whoever we might call them, whether you're a Zen Buddhist or whatever, are sort of a commonality, can at least serve to bring people together.
Absolutely. And there's much that's in common. I mean, when you really get down to it, it's like all of the great religious and spiritual traditions are saying the same thing. And one of the things they're saying always is to try to come awake, to be awake in the present moment. And sometimes we hear about, a God out there, but it was Jesus who said the kingdom is within. And it's in that idea is in all the great traditions of being awake, of being aware that this is it, this is our life, this is what we're doing now, and being able to appreciate that and be in it.
I think the present moment is at once an easy and difficult recipe or prescription, if you will, for lots of our ailments, because so many of us are always planning for the future, or we're thinking about, at very least, we're thinking about what we're going to do tomorrow or
tonight. And what we did wrong yesterday, we would have do it different. Oh yeah, it's the hardest thing. I mean, you're right. It sounds like the simplest thing, and it is the most difficult thing. So one person said to me, reading the book, said, it's this stuff you talk about being in the moment and what you can get out of that. He says, that's just a lot of New Age stuff. I said, no, it's not new at all. I said, it goes back thousands and thousands of years, but people still have to work toward it. And even though you've done it for a while, I mean, I find myself falling out of that and then having to really struggle to get back in, and to struggle to get back into a meditation practice and into being aware of what's going on.
In the real world.
Yeah.
Incredibly, our time has come to an end. I'd like to ask you to close with a poem that you've included by Buckminster Fuller. He wrote this, I believe, after he saw a photograph of the Earth taken in space by the astronauts.
Yes. Dear God of galaxies, we give thanks for being. We give thanks for being here. We give thanks for being here together. Rides on earth together, brothers and sisters on a bright loveliness in the eternal cold, brothers and sisters who know they are truly brothers and sisters. Amen and amen.
And I'm grateful you could be with us, Dan.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on our discussion with.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.